Well, thank you all for joining us. COVID-19 is transforming education, and many parents have concerns about the safety of their children. A national survey reveals 30 to 40% of parents are considering keeping their kids home in the fall, and that could come in the form of homeschooling. It's no doubt why you're with us right now, and many there are a lot of unknowns. Is homeschooling the right choice for my child? How do I navigate this? I've homeschooled my children. They've been in traditional and charter schools, and each one was the right choice at the time. And I can say homeschooling is daunting. So today we simply want to give you as much information as we can on the option of homeschooling and answers as many questions as we can in this next hour. And we are lucky to have two top education leaders with us, Pima County Superintendent Dustin Williams, whose office handles the homeschooling option for parents, what's required, and he'll let you know about that. And former Superintendent John Petticone of Flowing Wells District and TUSD. He's going to walk us through what students need to learn in any of the options. We're going to focus on homeschooling. Now, let's get started. So let's first start with you, Dustin Williams. Tell me how then your office deals with the homeschooling option for parents.
Thank you for having this, Valerie. It's really important for the community to, number one, have a voice and to hear their challenges. As a father right now with two boys looking to go back to school, I share everybody's concerns. So obviously Arizona is a choice state and parents get to choose what they want to do. And if one of those options is a district school, a charter school, or a private school, or a homeschool, those are their options. And so if they would elect to go to homeschool, they simply come to our office and they fill out an affidavit of intent. It's by law between the ages of 6 to 16. You got to do something. You have to be enrolled in one or the other. And that's how you do it.
Are there any restrictions? Or are there any demands that are placed on the parents in order to make sure that their students get a good education?
The answer to that is no. And what I want the public to know is homeschool is an option. And right now we want to be a little hesitant of jumping into that because homeschooling is very difficult. District schools and charter schools and private schools have mechanisms to do remote learning if the legislature will allow those tools to be available. And if that is the option, that's the first thing that we would like the parents to do, is to have those discussions with their schools and see what are the options for remote learning. We have about 3,500 approximately in Pima County of homeschool parents. And if you do elect to go that route, it really is 100% on the parent, like all of it. And schools can provide certain services as far as special education and different testing sites and so forth, but it's hard. It really is. And I just want everyone to know that pulling your son or your daughter out, I value your concerns and I understand that. But before we do that decision, I think it's really good to find out what is the plan for remote learning and is that an option for you at your school?
Let's go to John Petticone. Now, John, you were a superintendent of Flowing Wells and the NTUSD districts. Now, we want to remain neutral in this because we want people to be able to decide on their own about this homeschooling option. I have done this as well. I did it for a year, and I agree with Dustin that it is very difficult to do. Not that it can't be done, it's just difficult to do. So kind of walk me through, and I know you know this issue as well because you deal with that even in a district level of people going outside of the districts. Now kind of walk me through a little bit of what is that when you know that a parent and a student is going to go to the homeschooling option. What are you concerned about? What do you tell them?
Okay. Well, first let me start out by saying that I really truly believe that there are really effective homeschool situations, and then there are those that are not effective. I can go back to the middle to late 80s when I first started dealing with this in Flowing Wells, and I thought that there would be some restrictions and some controls on what a homeschool parent had to do. And you expect that there'll be some requirements by the state and then implemented by the county. What I found out very quickly was that there really aren't any. In fact, if you look, and you can pull this up on your own pretty easily, if you look at what the law requires regarding homeschooling, it just basically says that you've got to notify the county superintendent's office in particular, and you've got to let the authorities know that you're planning on doing this. There's no qualifications as far as being a teacher, certified teacher, or anything else. You really have a series of state mandated subjects at all levels you've got to be aware of, and that's general kind of requirements. And then when you get to the high school level, it becomes much more specific. But there's no testing, state mandated assessments that are required at all. And you don't have to worry about some of the other things you'd worry about when kids come to school, things like immunizations and so forth. So those things became pretty evident as a real kind of a convenience for parents. But then you start looking at, can parents do this effectively? And boy, when you see networks of parents that have homeschooled situations and they do it well, you see some pretty impressive things going on. And then I can share with you, I saw the opposite of that, where you had, parents that thought it would be a lot easier. In some cases, they did it for a lot of personal reasons. You could then get concerned about what's happening with children that are in those situations. Are they getting what's required for them? And then, of course, many times we would get homeschooled students that came back into the system after they'd been out and being homeschooled, let's just say for 6 years. And all of a sudden now we're transitioning them back into the middle school, which is a difficult time for any student anyway. And then to have programs that were specifically suited to bring students in that may not have had, typical socialization experiences that you'd have in a traditional public school or a charter school was challenging. So those are things I just want to make sure that we kind of put on the forefront before we even look at what's required. So for me as a school administrator, I really want that communication to be there with any parent that's thinking about doing it. I'm going to be the administrator and everybody will handle this differently. But I think I know all the superintendents in the Valley, and they're going to want to help make sure that parents are aware and prepared for what they're getting into. So communication with the school district, I think, is really important, and that's easy to do. Just make the phone call, visit the superintendent's office, the district office, and each district will set you up with people that can help you understand what comes next. And as far as what goes on during the year, as Dustin mentioned, we're required to provide special education services and a number of other things in the district that will not go away. That requirement is federal, and it's something we take very, very seriously. So there are opportunities that students can engage in through their local school district, even as a homeschooled child. And so in the case of Flowing Wells, I remember we set programs up for homeschooled children to get involved in extracurricular activities. It was important to me as a school leader that we made that available for students, but we had to really work at making sure we could do that effectively. So it's things like that. You communicate with that county superintendent's office for sure, because they're going to give you the information you need. And then with that school district to be sure that things change along the way, and parents may find out that this was not what they thought it was going to be, and they want to look at some methodology to get kids back into the traditional school setting. And so I'd like to be able to know that that's possible before it becomes a kind of a crisis situation. So those are just some things to think about.
Yeah, no, that's great, because we do have some comments. I'm looking at some of the live comments here, and there are a few of them who have homeschooled their kids or currently homeschooling their kids. And they say, yes, it's challenging, but it is it's a wonderful option. Carrie Fett, I hope I got that last name correct. That's what she said. It's a wonderful option as well. But some of these comments that are coming down right now, it is also about the safety. What is it going to look like when you return to school, these kids return to school? I think it's the unknown factor right now that is really driving the consideration of homeschooling for these parents to pull them out of any district, schools, charter schools, private schools, whatever the case may be. So Dustin, if you can speak to that, because I know you've been looking into the safety issue right now. And yes, I mean, when you're at home, you protect your children as well. But what are you seeing right now in the districts? I don't know if we've got it frozen there, but John, why don't you answer the question about safety issues of schools, what they're dealing with, and we're looking at maybe even some remote learning, hybrid situations in the schools. Could that also be an option for the homeschooling parents, the considerations?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that every superintendent in Arizona, I'm sure across the country, but in Arizona, is looking at what do we do now? Because now what we've done is we've opened up an opportunity. I mean, I look at it on both sides, the yin and the yang, the The yin is pretty obvious. It's been pretty difficult. But the yang is that now we know we can do certain things. And in fact, as a result of this crisis, certain resources have been provided to allow school districts to have more options. The upside of that is going to be something that'll be interesting to watch. So school superintendents across the country, and certainly in Arizona, are looking at what do we do to open in a different way. And by the way, do we open? And I know the governor said, we want schools to open as quickly as we possibly can. But if I were still doing that work, I would be saying, yeah, I want the same thing, but I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to place our children in anything but a safe situation. If I can't guarantee that there's safety at a level that's acceptable to me, then I'm going to fight you on that, and I'm not going to do it. So, and school boards are going to be really instrumental in deciding what they want for their communities, and that's going to be important as well. So with regard to safety, look, I don't think anybody knows, what that's going to look like when August rolls around, when the end of July, August rolls around. Every school district right now is doing a comprehensive look at what are those details that many people don't think about, by the way. And school districts, I would argue, are thinking about it in a way that only they are able to do, about what they do to transition in. And think about this too, that yes, first priority simply has to be children, not just words, true. But to do that, it means I have employees, staff, and faculty I've got to be concerned about as well. So how do I protect students when they're on our campus? Do as much as I can to be sure that that when they leave us, that we're protecting the community that they're going into. What are those transitional issues look like? If we're going to have, and you mentioned, hybrid models, I think every school district is looking at whether that's possible now, and is there a way to do that? When I start looking at those issues, it gets real complicated, because I've got to have changes at the state level in terms of how we get resources and revenue. Right now, the only way that we get paid is for the number of students that are in our school on a daily attendance issue. Well, if I'm going to have a hybrid, that's going to mean that kids may or may not be actively involved in our system for periods of time during the day. And if I want to really be progressive about that, then I have to make sure that I'm getting revenue to be able to support, that objective. So there are a lot of things that school districts are doing now to think about how we open schools in the fall, things that parents would not be thinking about. And I would argue they're going to be doing things that are going to be over the top in terms of trying to make sure that our children are safe. I would be looking at your local school district to find out what are those things that school districts are doing. I think when we find out what they look like, we're going to be surprised at the detail and the detail that's been implemented school district by school district, to be sure they're thinking about as many things as they can to make it as safe and as flexible as possible.
Well, let's go to a question. Ellen Poe had a question specifically. When will school districts be able to tell parents which options will be available to the families? Will there be multiple options? Some can do remote, some can come to schools, and then hybrids. We've seen that the Arizona Department of Education has come up with a roadmap that gave those three options. And the schools then can decide on those options. And it's any school, whether it's private, it's charter, or it's the districts as well. And I do know TUSD will be announcing sometime this month what they plan to do. Sunnyside at the very end of the month. Those are our two largest districts. I don't know if you've heard anything, John, about other districts, but it's pretty much, I think I'm gathering, at least within this month, they will kind of secure a plan, which will be fluid too, as well, right, John?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can trust that school districts want to get that information out as soon as possible. They don't like ambiguity. No system not no system. Most systems don't like ambiguity. They like something that people can count on, that creates a level of stability, that gives people confidence and does the things to answer the questions that people have during this broadcast. So I would expect that within the next few weeks, you're going to be hearing every school district will come out with a plan for how they plan to do this. And then again, it's going to be a dynamic model, because you've seen what's happened in the last couple of months. It seems like week by week we learn more. So as that information becomes more available, I think school districts will make a model that they have for their community, and then subject to whatever change the dynamics of the situation require.
Let's go to some of the pros of homeschooling. I guess we lost Dustin Williams. Hopefully we can get him back.
Yeah, I hope so.
There we go. All right, Dustin.
Welcome to the world, everybody.
That's our new norm at this point, you know.
Sorry to the viewers. I lost everything, but I'm sure Dr. Petticone has got it for me.
Yes, actually, you know what? Let's turn to you now. Basically, I'm looking at some of these comments, and let's look at some of the pros of homeschooling. The homeschooling sometimes really does help those with underlying conditions. If they need, you know, there's this homebound law, and you and I have done a story on that as well, where kids simply just cannot come to school because of an illness or an accident, and they're physically unable to do that. So there's been these systems set up in districts, but you know, even beyond that, with the homeschooling option, is that you can alternate, you can adjust your schedule throughout the day. So if you can give maybe our viewers some perspective on some of the positives of homeschooling.
Sure. Number one, obviously, is support structures and mechanisms. And so what we know, what works with homeschooling communities, and we've had the homeschool communities, we've invited them to our office, we've had meet and greets, and what we know that works really, really well is when they get us other families involved and they find out what they're doing and what works, and working together as teams, we see that as a positive structure for them. When we talk about the homebound laws, remember, that's still an option where schools actually have what are called homebound teachers. And so those teachers would actually be doing the facilitating of the education for the family still. So that would still be the student and the family enrolled at a school, and then the school actually providing the education, but the son or the daughter would physically not be at the school. And so those are the two things we really want to focus on for the families, is the options of what can they do. When we left, call it mid-March or beginning of April with COVID, there was a bill called House Bill 2910, and that gave schools full authority to do remote learning. And the schools did a remarkable job. I mean, it was truly incredible how they put this together in literally record time. I tell everyone I know, the smartest people that I've ever met are the administrators and the leaders of these schools, because they can just do stuff that is incredible, like the graduations we saw that they just put together literally in 30 days. And they did that, and there was a happy medium in there. If a parent can have those options, they might not necessarily have to go directly homeschool. And if they do, which they have the right, it is a law like we've talked about, the best thing they can do is start to get together with other families and find out what's working and what are their best practices.
Some of these options that we really want to talk about, what are those support mechanisms that are out there for anybody who wants to, any parent who wants to homeschool? Jillian Cox wrote that a lot of homeschool network groups keep up with the standards of schools. They socialize, offer art and band classes, and make sure they keep their kids doing what kids do. John, if you can speak to this as far as keeping up, and she brought this up, the standards of the state of the schools. So if you can speak to that.
Sure, yeah, and I want to go back to my first comment when we started this broadcast, and that's that I'm completely supportive of the fact that there are really effective homeschool situations, and there's no question about it. I noticed in her comment, the exclamation point, it kind of implied to me that there was getting a sense that they can't provide the quality that public schools can. And I would argue that there are certain things that homes cannot do and certain things that schools can't do. So there's no editorial comment on the quality of really effective homeschool programs, other than that I've seen many of them. So yeah, I mean, I think what you're looking at is having an informed, and a group I think is a good idea. It's hard to do on your own. Some parents do it very well, by the way. I've seen that as well, where you've got, you have parents that are themselves informed, that have educational and instructional ability, that understand obviously their children very well and how they can be a really effective, not just a first teacher, but then an ongoing teacher in their child's life. And so that does happen. But generally, the best programs that I've seen and the best situations have been where people get together. They're sincerely interested in creating an environment that meets the intent of why they would even think about homeschooling. You know, when one of the reasons to homeschool, and it's a primary one now, is the safety of your child when you've got what's going on with the pandemic. You certainly understand that as a compelling reason for parents to be wary about putting their children into any collective environment, you know, and I would agree with that 100%. But so if that's the reason, then certainly we know what's driving it. But when it's other reasons, and there are lots of them, why a parent would want to keep their child home and homeschool, then my advice is that you get together with others that may have similar feelings and try to put that program that the last caller spoke about, where you can do some remarkable things to include those extracurricular activities that are so important to a child's development. Socialization with other children. You know, when I mentioned earlier that we had to create programs to transition students back into public schools, that's a serious issue. Certainly for me as a school administrator, as a principal or a superintendent, how do I take care of a child that's coming to me that may have had a very different experience than children that have been in place for a number of years? So you just have to be aware of that. Do what you can to try to create an environment that's healthy for your child. You'll do that. Serious parents will do that. And the best way to do that is to over communicate with as many organizations and entities as you can, and you'll set upon something that works for your child. And that's wonderful. You know, public schools were formed for a number of reasons. If you go back to the history of public education, they were really formed to help parents who couldn't do certain things to have their children educated. And a lot of it had to do with religious reasons, but it was really designed to be sure that all children got an equal education. And we can argue about what all meant in the early days, but certainly today is that we want equity and equality for all of our children. If a parent can do that on their own, fine. You know, I mean, I don't think any public school person would argue against it, but the concern is being sure that you provide the subject matter that a child needs in order to be able to be successful at all levels. And then depending on what you have in mind for your child and your child has in mind for themselves, how do you maintain a level of high success for those children when they leave the home? And that's, you know, if a parent can do that, the best way to do it, I think, is collectively. That's been my experience. And if you're going to make a mistake, over communicating, not under communicating.
John, let's talk about the complexities of the state standards. And Dustin, you can chime in after this as well. You know, the bar has been raised tremendously, sure, especially going from Ames to AZ Merit, and who knows what's going to come next, especially as, in a sense, education is transforming right now before our eyes, and the district. So what will the state be doing with that? How difficult is it for parents? And you may have seen some parents who have homeschooled and then they transition back to, or the first time to, a district or a school, charter school, whatever that might be. How difficult is it to kind of go back and forth if that's what's going to happen? You
want to take it, Dustin? You want me to?
I'll take the first part. Valerie, it's really difficult, to be honest. We find, from what I know, is when the student comes back into the school, first of all, the standardized testing, which we all agree, you know, it is turned into its own animal, right? First there was the Ames, then they changed it, and then it's all based on corporations that own those. And do we all agree with standardized testing? Obviously, no. Is there a happy medium with assessing students? Yes. We want to know how they're, you know, fulfilling their mastery. And that is one area where the homeschool community looks to see how do they measure their students and where are they at that grade level. And that's sometimes the conversations that we have is how can we help the homeschool community know where they're at? When you're in the school, you're going to have what's called your normal rating or your norms rating, which is just basically if you looked at the entire school, the third graders test at this particular level, and you can kind of, you know, get a gist of where the student is cognitively and going forward. When you're in the homeschool arena, it does sometimes get a little bit difficult. I have had some parents say, what can I do to test my child to kind of find out where they are? And again, this is really important, what everyone needs to know. When you're going homeschool, it's so important to still have that relationship with your neighborhood school, your district school, and ask these questions, because the district schools can do all sorts of neat things. We actually, when we had the homeschool community come, that was one of their asks is, how do I get my student involved with the school at the career and technical education level? So we introduced them to JTED. They can go into certain things, and that's really important. It's not just an exit. We don't want people to exit the schools. We want them to have a relationship with their schools and find out what is that happy medium there. And especially when it comes to standardized testing, and when you get into the high school level with AP exams and college exams, SATs and ACTs, and those are really important strategies to still work with your school and have those options.
You want to take it, John?
Sure. Yeah, let me go back just a little bit and discuss the standards themselves, because you start looking at assessment and now you're entering into a little bit of a different world than maybe the question that you asked focused on. So let me just also tell you that I was on the Arizona State Board of Education when we were discussing in the early days high stakes testing, and my concern about high stakes testing always was what's the appropriate level of testing for children. How do we treat them with respect and dignity throughout the year and test them appropriately for its intent? And the trouble with the state assessment programs across the country, where they became politicized in ways that I felt were not necessarily healthy at all for our children, and certainly not for our school system. So we ended up over the years coming up with agreements on how we test students, and I think it's so much better today than it was 15 years ago when a lot of these debates were taking place. So setting up assessments is one thing, and we still struggle with it today, but I think it's in a better place than it was several years ago. But in terms of standards, I think people need to understand that standards were not created by a bunch of wacky educators sitting in a room coming up with great grandiose ideas. They were created by a community that said, what do children need to know in Arizona? And I'd also argue, by the way, that if you look from state to state, the state standards look pretty similar. But what do students need to know in order to be successful? And since we have a global community, students are going to be entering a world where they're going to be interfacing with kids from all over the country and all over the world. What do we do to be sure that they can be competitive, to use that word, and successful? So the standards were created to do a number of different things. What should children from first grade or kindergarten all the way through graduation know? And then what are the subjects and the topics that need to be addressed that interact effectively with each level? So if a student is going to learn a whole division at one level, what do they need to know fundamentally before that in order for them to be successful with that topic, and so on? So much work has gone into creating standards that we believe, I think in Arizona, are pretty good. So what I think you want to do is look at that. And then there's open source material, by the way, that provides curriculum opportunities for parents to access, to look at what learning lessons apply to what standards. There are also assessments you can access that will help you do that along the way. And assessment is not a dirty word. It should be something that helps us all know, are we doing the job we need to do, and are students getting what they should get at a certain level in order to be successful as they move forward? So it isn't about assessment being good or bad. It's about using assessment effectively and appropriately for what you're trying to achieve. And so so for me, the standards are not easy, and they shouldn't be, but they're also accessible. And if you find yourself in a homeschool situation, I would be looking at making sure that my child is on track, standard by standard, level by level. And the good news is, if you find that they're not, you can do some adjustments with your children in a smaller environment that may be more difficult in a larger, more collective environment. So, I mean, those are things that I think you really have to be aware of. What are the standards? How do I get materials around them? And I think Dustin said it as I did earlier. Get together with your local school district, and they're not going to be resistant. My experiences, they're not going to be resistant to helping you. They're just going to want to be reasonable in how we do that.
Yeah, and the expectations have changed as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to a question now. This comes from, and I guess it's Gelly Contreras. I hope I got that first name right. But she wants to know, what about special needs? Kids with IEPs, how does that work? Dustin, can you take that?
You know what? And again, that is a phenomenal question. My son is on the spectrum. He has autism, and he's a little kinder going into first. And the great question. Again, that's where, and I can't emphasize this enough, the relationship with your district school is critical to a T. Because they still can provide services. You know, how that looks is really up to the district and the policies that they follow and the laws that need to be met. So John will be able to, or Dr. Petticone, excuse me, will be able to explain, like, when a parent still needs those services, the district school can come still help.
Even in the homeschool option. So I've heard that as well. And that even applies to sports. Yeah, John, if you can please address that.
Yeah, I mean, the responsibility and the requirement federally as well is that the responsibility for addressing the needs of exceptional education students falls directly on the shoulders of the school district. So without question, that's the responsibility of your local school district. The difficulty comes when if exceptional education is handled effectively, as any exceptional education parent knows, you're working closely with professionals to be sure you're providing what that student needs, that child needs, according to a number of different levels: social, emotional, academic, and so forth. So depending on what the exceptionality is for a child, that understanding and that relationship with the school district needs to be very, very close. Well, it's of course much easier when you're in a school setting. It's much more difficult when the student is being homeschooled. And by the way, I mentioned earlier, you know, school districts are an organization. They have to be concerned about where they're getting the resources to be able to provide those kinds of options. They're going to do it no matter what. But if parents want to help make that more effective for their children, advocate hard, advocate strongly for getting full funding. And full funding doesn't mean complete funding for every child. It means the kind of resources we need to do the job that we're being expected to do. And so when it comes to homeschooled exceptional education relationship, boy, you talk about communication. I mean, if you're not totally integrated with that multidisciplinary team at that school level that's going to be working with your child, especially since now there's distance between you and the school, normally, you're going to have problems. And so is the school district providing the resources and support that they need to do for you. So, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult venture on a lot of different levels, but with exceptional ed students, we take that very, very seriously. That's not only our obligation, but our moral responsibility. And I think you're not going to find a school administrator that doesn't feel that way.
So what you're saying is that even though a parent chooses to homeschool, being connected to the district, they can have a lot of their questions answered because that is their right if they live in that district, correct?
Yeah, it's their right. And I think it's, obligation and rights are interesting things. You know, they're two sides of that scale. The obligation of the parent is real as well. You know, if you want the work to be done effectively, then, you know, live up to your obligation to be sure you're connecting with people in a way that's effective and that's productive. And I think you're going to find that school districts will be cooperative. There's tension. You know, that's why you hear about due process hearings, even in school districts that have children, 100% of the time. We may differ on what we believe is the best situation for your child. It happens periodically, and so we try to work that out. But that's where team.
Oh, we just got some technical difficulty there, Dustin. If you could pick this up, and in terms.
Let me go ahead and go right where John is. The schools they're gonna come through for you 100%, and they're gonna help out as much as they possibly can. As a father with a son, I got two boys that has special needs, autism. This remote learning, without a doubt, has been very difficult for us. Trying to sit down and do the Zoom and the different strategies, and you can see from the speech pathologists to the our autism ABA community. Kudos to them all. They have done amazing jobs and they're trying the best that they can. But boy, having my little guy sit down on a Zoom meeting and do it has been really, really hard. I want to just say that. I want to tell it what it is. For my son that has autism, he's again, the 6-year-old, intellectually or cognitively, the way his mind works is it's fascinating. Like, he's so smart. I think he's probably smarter. He's way smarter than me, but I mean, he is so, it's amazing. Like, his audio, visual, he remembers everything. It's truly incredible. But the social emotional part is that's all we care about right now, because he can point to a map, tell you any country, whatever, and he's 6. But I need him around kids. That's our big thing with my wife and I. And that part is where we're seeing a little difficulty as far as making sure he's progressing well in the right way. And that's where the schools come in for, especially students with special needs, is that interaction is so important. And so, when we go to the homeschool community, we talk to the homeschool community. Again, if they have those focus and those peer groups, that is the most important thing for what I think. I mean, obviously, it's just my opinion, and everybody's going to have their own. But when you can have a relationship with another group of people that can meet together in parks and can do stuff at homes, and again, this is all now changing because of the COVID pandemic, and that will really dictate everything going forward, is the cases and the statistics of what this thing is, and it's just it's a lot for all of us. I want, I share everyone's feelings at home and on this, and I'm so glad, Valerie, that you're having these conversations, because it just gives us a moment to really be real, right? And just have these conversations. But again, it can be done well. There needs to be support structures, and the district school is going to be an intro, very important part of it.
Dustin, does your office also provide information like that, a kind of steering parents who want to homeschool or consider homeschooling, just to let them know where to look?
Yeah, schools.pima.gov, schools.pima.gov. We have resources that are there. And we are more than happy to have focus groups. If there's anything the homeschool community wants and they want to meet and have conversations, our office is open to you 24/7. It really is. And we'll have meetings downtown. We're on 200 North Stone, or we can do virtual Zoom. We can do all sorts of stuff. One thing also to take in mind is I do know some parents in the homeschool community, and they say to me, Dustin, sometimes I feel overload, because if you try to go online and look for resources and curriculum, it's really hard. Like, even school districts, they think about this all the time. Like, what is our curriculum and how we're going to use it? And so imagine a family trying to put together their own curriculum system. It's hard. It really is hard. And that's what I just want everyone to really recognize, that, even though it's an option, if the districts can do a virtual option, which we're seeing they can do, they have homebound teachers, I think that would be the first step first, is to say, hey, can my district school provide this? And is it happy for me if the student's at home? What schools look like when they open is a whole nother conversation that we're literally having, Valerie, every day.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem here, because parents have to make these choices now. They need to know what to plan for. They got to worry about childcare. They got to worry about their work. And having the districts wait, or the schools, and they have to do their planning as well. They don't want to, say a plan without not ready for that. So you're in this mix here, this middle ground, especially in this month. So for parents, and I homeschooled as well, I actually used a more national system, Arizona Connections Academy. So there are those out there that they've already done all of the standardized testing. They provide all the books. They provide all of the what we call tools for hands-on learning, things like that. My daughter thoroughly enjoyed it in 4th grade. My son was in 8th grade, not so much, being a middle schooler and at home. So there are those options as well. Do either one of you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, well, Vella, I'd ask you. I mean, I think that's just great that you had that experience. But what did you find then when you were dealing with, your own children at home, the intimacy of being able to have that relationship? Boy, the ability to do that is just a gift. And I assume that they then entered the traditional school setting in either charter or public. What did you find as a parent? I think that's important information. What did you find?
Because of the Arizona Connections Academy was aligned with the state standards. So it was easy for them to jump back in. The thing is that it was juggling 2 children at the same time. So because I had my son was in 8th grade, well, he could do some of that on his own. My daughter, she really needed the encouragement. She really needed the extra help from me. So I could only do this for 1 year. Simply because it was too much of a workload for me. I had to get back to work, that type of stuff. So this is why when you make these decisions, especially this particular time, when you're making these decisions on safety and looking at the homeschool option, I completely understand where parents are. And I think if I had still had kids in K-12, I would be looking at that too. What do I do? So I think, the pros and cons of homeschooling really depends on each individual child.
Yeah, and I agree. And so as a superintendent, if you and I were in the same district, I'd be sitting with you as often as I could to find out, number one, what's your experience? Are we doing what we need to do? And if I know up front that it's probably going to be a temporary homeschool relationship, then I really want to have an opportunity to interact with with your children at some point, because they're coming back to me, and I want to be sure that I'm doing the job correctly. And I really like what you did when you're in that network and you found it to be effective. You did your homework. You did what you had to do to be an effective homeschool parent, and that's the obligation that you took seriously. If a parent does that and works with school districts, you're going to find hopefully a successful experience.
And Dustin, what have you found in that arena as far as parents who, even if they enter, they might not know everything. And at this point, and especially now, sometimes people look a year before they pull the trigger and decide on homeschooling. Now parents are looking at a month, and to be able to get that kind of information to make an educated decision on what's best for their child. So if you could just weigh in on that.
Yeah, that Valerie, I mean, really you hit it on the head. It's the engagement of the parent. It really is. It's another full-time job. It's 40 hours a week. It's teaching your son or your daughter we go back to the standards. It's making sure they're getting the best education as they would in their regular school. And so what we find is parents in the homeschool community are doing that. I mean, there are parents that do it really, really well. There are parents that we don't know. I'm just going to tell you that flat out, that we don't know what is going on. And we're not saying that that's a bad thing or a good thing, but it is good to know when we speak to the parents that have really have they have their communities, they have their partnerships, they kind of help us out and guide us as to what works. They have different conferences in the summer. There was big organizations where they would meet and get different strategies and curriculums, and unfortunately those are going to be gone in person. Hopefully they come back for virtual, but those were good resources for the homeschool community because they would find out what was kind of the newest trends and what's working. And so again, everything is about a support system, and everything is about a workload. And so when a parent has a regular full-time job, even if they're going to be able to work at home remotely, remember that child needs to have just an excellent education. And so the parents have to understand that it's a heavy lift. It really is. And I commend you, Valerie, for taking that step and diving in there. And firsthand how hard it is. I mean, for us as take the superintendent hat off, put on the father hat. For me right now, especially with my 2 boys, remote learning was so hard. I've been an educator for 20 years. I taught elementary. I was an administrator. Teaching my son, both sons, is hard. It's a different feeling. It's when he gets something wrong in his work, and I'm going through it, and I'm using my other son right now because Dre, my son with the autism, is in a whole new world, right? It's wild. But my other one, we could do the daily check-ins, we could do the Zooms, we could do the stuff. But when he would get something wrong, it wasn't like when a student got something wrong in class. So a student gets something wrong in class, we could correct the issue and we could move forward. And the student was like, oh, my teacher's kind of telling me how to do it correctly. With my other son, he's going to be a third grader. He kind of really got upset that he was kind of letting daddy down. And that's where we had to find that balance, which was, it's okay to get this wrong, even though we're doing remote learning, and try to not take it so personally. But it's really hard to kind of explain that to an 8-year-old, right? And so I've used this before. It's kind of an education stick. You have your pre-K up to your post-secondary and into college and so forth. And as you go down that stick and you get into those lower grades, the remote learning option it's hard. It's just it's different. Not that it can't be done well, which it can. It really can if it's put together and schools or parents have those options. But it just gets a little bit more difficult. Whereas we see the older kids, they get a little bit more used to already being online. They kind of know the gist of the computers and how to type stuff out, and computers are interesting because sometimes there's a certain word count number. So all of that is really unique, Valerie.
Yeah, we got about 10 minutes left. John, let's talk about subjects, because we know, for example, in math, if you fall behind 1 year, you can catch up. By the second year, if you fall behind, whether you're in a district or you're homeschooling, it is very difficult, almost impossible to catch up. And this is where the kids, when they get into that high school grades, they really struggle with especially some of the top level math. So let's just talk about some of the topics. That was just an example, but let's talk about some of the topics and what should homeschool, if they choose that option, parents and students choose that option, what should they really be focusing on? Which subjects, which ones are difficult? Kind of weigh in on that.
Well, okay, so you go to the state standard, you go to the state website on what's required for students grade level by grade level, and you're going to get a very clear look at what experts and community members together have decided should be at every level of a child's development. They didn't start in first grade in the early years, but I think now there's a template from kindergarten all the way through the end of high school. So you look at what's required level by level, and then you're going to find out what subjects are, for a lot of reasons, designated by grade level. And a lot of it has to do with developmental ability. It has to do with is a child ready to be able to study? And it's not just in math. If you can take a look at the broad spectrum of subjects across all grade levels, you're going to see that there are certain times when a student's able to develop skills more appropriately for certain subjects at certain grade levels. So that's all been decided in these standards, and you can take a look at that and know what's got to be emphasized and got to be focused on, has to be focused on. Let's go back to standards for a second and assessment. The concern that I mentioned earlier about assessment is, what are you assessing and for what purpose? So if I remember the early days of Dustin mentioned some of the early models of our state assessment program. Well, there were real concerns about, why does the student need to, what's emphasized, by the way, when I give a student a test at the end of a certain period of time, if the issue is, what is the state assessment focusing on that I should have been looking at as a teacher to be able to prepare that student more appropriately, I've got a problem, because they used to call them kind of power standards. What do I really focus on so that I can make sure that a student during the assessment process is successful? Well, over the years, it's been 40 years now since I've been looking at this thing in Arizona. And in the early days, there were not homeschool communities, by the way. There were individuals that chose to keep their children home. And then they finally, over time, began to get together, form organizations that would do this work more effectively. And then they form these networks that you're talking about. So it's much easier today because you can get some support to do that. But subject by subject, grade level by grade level, all the way through in a connected way, both scope and sequence, is designed for you through the state standards. You've got to look at that and got to be prepared to say, am I prepared to be able to teach those subjects and those areas at each grade level? If I am, great. If I'm not, what do I need to do to be able to provide that to my child? And sometimes through those networks, there are certain parents that are more appropriate for certain subjects at certain grade levels than others. And again, if you've got that kind of network, maybe you can work that out. But it is not an easy proposition at all. None of this really is. One of the things that concerns me about homeschool, I'll share with you. I saw the other side of it too as an administrator. I saw parents in the early days that kept their children home because they could. There was really no control. And they would keep them home because they had 3 or 4 children and needed somebody to babysit for those kids. That was a reality. So we'd get the word from community members that they saw 5 kids.
We'll get back to John. Dustin.
I'll go on that question of,
Sure.
of math. Obviously homeschool communities, they are in tune with the state standards, and making sure you're at that appropriate grade level efficiency. If you need to have the algebra, you have the algebra. If you have the geometry, you have the geometry. These students have to have that sort of education in process. So it's again.
There are a lot. We have seen so many success stories, especially with student athletes. Even those who are training for the Olympics and all that. They participate in some programs. They are homeschooled because of the different schedules. They just cannot work within the system. We've seen so many cases where students actually excel better when they're from home, when they're working at home. So, when parents hear about those things, they think, well, I can do that for my child as well. And they can. There's been a couple of comments here. There was one where a parent had said, I homeschool from kindergarten to graduation.
Sure.
And it's very, very successful. We're running out of time, so I just kind of want to wrap this up. So if you can, we'll start with Dustin first. If you can just kind of give the pros and cons of homeschooling and then your last thoughts.
Sure. So the pros are you're with your child all the time, right? Who doesn't want to be with their son or daughter all day long? I mean, that's all I like to do is hang out with my kids when I'm not working. The cons are sometimes they drive me a little crazy. I'm not going to lie, right? Like trying to do the remote learning has been very challenging at times. So it's kind of that yin and that yang. What we would like is our office, schools.pima.gov, have a conversation with us first. We would be more than happy to connect the dots. Know your district's plan, your school's plan, charter, private, all that. Know what they're doing first also. Find out if that's something that you agree with. And if it is, then maybe that's the route for you. I think right now we're all in this new era of pandemic and COVID, and rightfully so. We all have these feelings. Just most importantly, when ideas come out and things happen, let's all try to be as respectful as possible and listen, even if the idea is to your liking or isn't to your liking, at least listen to them. And then whatever your choice is, we'll respect that no matter what. That is our office's commitment, is leadership, service, and collaboration. We will help anyone out there. But really that relationship with your district is going to be really important.
All right, John, let's hear from you. Basically pros and cons, and then your last thoughts as well.
So real quickly, the pros are, as Dustin said, I think the intimacy of the relationship you have with your child, your child's learning. I mean, you can't overstate that. I think it's wonderful. If you can do the job well, boy, there's no better teacher than the parent for a child all the way through. And I really respect that parent that, remarkable, homeschool their child from kindergarten through their graduation. It's just fantastic. If they're able to do that effectively, that's really what should be happening. The cons are that that's not the case in every situation. And I can.
Yeah, and I think.
All right, so
there we go. You're back. Go ahead.
The fact that there's no state assessment requirement, that there's no really accountability on the part of of the parent who chooses to do it. If it's a sincere parent, that's like the parents that we're seeing writing in, God bless. If it's not, there's exploitation that's possible that is really a difficult for me as an educator and as a parent to accept. But anyway, I'd like to believe that that's the exception. So the upside is the intimacy. The downside is the potential for exploitation. Now, the final comments I have is work with your local school district. You're going to see some interesting creative models coming out now as the yang on this pandemic that might suit you very well. So homeschooling may not be your option, but do your research and let's see what we can do together to make a successful experience for our children.
I guess at this point, parents have to do their homework if they're going to make this decision. Would you agree with that as well?
Yes.
And it's a lot of homework because I know I did that too.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. I'm sure we'll have this discussion again as we get closer to the school year. And hopefully we have a lot of parents who have more questions for us, and we'll continue this conversation going. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And if you'd like to review this entire webinar and share it with others, just go to KGUN9.com/rebound. We'll also be available on demand at KGUN9.com in our mobile app and on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV channels later today. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.